Well, joining me now to discuss trust in politics is former leader of the Scottish Labour Party and director of the John Smith Centre, Kezia Dugdale, and former BBC correspondent and former independent MP, the man in the white suit, Martin Bell. Kezia, Martin, good to speak to you tonight. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
Kezia, first of all, how would you describe the public's trust in politicians right now? Because what we've just heard there is pretty damning, isn't it?
Yes, it's as Sir John Curtis describes, it's at an all-time low. We've got figures now for several decades to evidence that. It's also really unequal. So we've known for some time now that even when trust is really low in politics and the political institutions and all our political processes, young people, women and those on low incomes are particularly distrustful of their politicians. If you're all three of those things, a young poor woman living in the East End of Glasgow, for example, you couldn't be further removed from the politicians that seek to represent you and act in your interests. And that's a real problem, because I would argue that's exactly the type of group who really need a government to act in their interest and improve the life chances of people like that.
And Martin Bell, why do you think this has happened? Why has public trust been eroded so much?
I think it goes back over a period of years. I would identify especially the MP's expenses scandal of something like 16 years ago, which caught up so many MPs. And I know there were something like 15 or 16 independents in the last Parliament having fallen out with their parties involved in some scandal, either personal, sexual or financial, on a scale not seen before. And the answer simply to me is if politicians want to be trusted more, they better behave better. It's as simple as that.
And Kezia, what's the answer to this? I know there's something that you've been working on since you stepped back from politics. Can this be changed?
We've got to believe it can be changed. Of course we do, but we're kidding ourselves if there's one single thing that you could do, right? When a problem has become this great over such a long period of time, there is no easy fix. There are some ideas, though, some places to start. The first thing we know is that rules should have consequences. When a politician breaks the rules, there should be a code of conduct that should be followed and consequences for that poor behaviour. That's the type of thing that you need just to be working to have the most elemental elements of trust in the system. Who our politicians are and who they represent really matters. So if we have a parliament, for example, that's full of white, middle-aged, middle-class men, they're very likely to act in the interests of white, middle-aged, middle-class men. That's why we need more young people, more people of colour from different class backgrounds to come forward and stand for parliament. And also this survey work that John Curtis has detailed today shows us that 79% of people think the political system itself is in need of improvement, that it might be broken. So looking at things like electoral reform and ensuring that people's votes actually count for something could go a long way to build trust. What's new about this research today, based on what I've said before about low levels of trust amongst young people and women and poor people in particular, is attitudes to Brexit are really playing into this particular survey. So people that voted leave and have then been really disappointed by Brexit have articulated that through feeling really disappointed with politicians in the round. That's a really interesting development and one we should watch closely.
And Martin, you were elected on an anti-sleaze ticket back in '97. How do things compare now to then in terms of public trust and the behaviour of politicians? Are they better, worse, the same?
I think in '97 we made a bit of a difference, and it lasted for a while. But I think things are worse now. The same number of MPs who find themselves in difficulties and being and falling out with their voters, a wide sense of mistrust. And I agree, and I think the Brexit experience had something to do with it. But I would also say that the answer lies with us. I think if we pay more attention to the quality of the individual candidate and less to the party label, we can be part of the way to the solution.
And do we need more consequences, Martin, as Kezia was suggesting, more consequences for behaviour that's not acceptable?
Yes, I think so. I served for 3.5 years on the Standards and Privileges Committee, and some of the cases that came before us were frankly appalling. The Parliament tends to circle the wagons and protect its own people. I think that we need to review the systems of sanctions and penalties so that those who transgress really do pay the price.
Kezia, what do you think the consequences of this loss of trust in our politicians could potentially be? What are your concerns?
So it can be really, really dangerous. And we didn't see this during COVID, and thank goodness for it. But when you have low levels of political trust, our response as human beings to that is to not want to follow the advice that we're given from our governments. So it could have been possible, for example, that we would choose not to follow the advice when it came to wearing masks or getting vaccines, for example. One of the reasons I think that didn't come to pass during the COVID pandemic, however, was that a lot of these key critical public health messages were not given to us by politicians. They were given to us by leading doctors and scientists who we have a much higher innate level of trust in. That's significant. One thing I think that's also worth mentioning, Fiona, is that we need to also understand, our political parties need to understand, the public think it's a plague on all your houses. So when you have a scandal like something like Partygate during the pandemic, where Boris Johnson was breaking the rules and drinking when we were all locked down in our own houses, you might think, oh, that was something that was good for the Labour Party. It led to, a boom for all the other political parties because the Tories had done something so negative. Actually, that's not how we, the public, perceive that. We think all politicians are the same and a plague on all their houses. So it's in the interest in all political parties to try and rebuild this trust. A lot of evidence in John Curtis's report today that says a way to do that is actually to address some of the poverty in the country and to rebuild the NHS. That's one part of a bigger picture that we need to build.
And Martin, what do you think some of the impact of this erosion of trust could be? Is it too simplistic to say it can impact straight onto turnout, for example? People just won't go and vote.
Well, that would be the worst possible. I think the people should be encouraged to vote more than ever, because the only remedy of this is going to be found through people voting for politicians who will be answerable to them. And not to vote is going to make things much, much worse.
Kezia, do you think this has a potential to impact on the safety of politicians? I mean, sadly, in recent times, we've had the killing of 2 elected members of Parliament. What about politicians' own safety?
Yes, it's pretty desperate. I know a lot of politicians who are still in Parliament today who worry a great deal about their own personal safety, and actually probably more importantly the safety of their staff, the people that work for them in their communities, in their offices, that maybe have shops on high streets, that are really exposed to people's anger and sense of frustration at political institutions. I don't see much evidence of that in this survey work. I think that's a product of something much darker that's going on, and that's this kind of rise of global populism that forces us into tribes and less tolerant of each other and more sure of our own righteousness and our own little teams, our own little tribes. That's something else we really need to take on. It's an even bigger challenge than trying to rebuild trust in politicians.
And that's an interesting, Martin, one point that Kezia has made there. Was politics, do you think, as tribal when you were an elected MP as it is now?
I think things have sort of slid backwards. I think that the many cases of misconduct between now and then have shown that the present system of sanctions and discipline is not good enough, and it has to be tightened. And if it's tightened and people go out and vote for better quality candidates, then I think we can turn this around.
Kezia, do you share that optimism? Is it fixable?
It's got to be fixable. I don't think there is a problem with the quality of our candidates. I think there's a problem with our political system, and that's the thing that needs a great deal of attention.
Good to speak to both of you. Thank you so much. Kezia Dugdale, there, Director of the John Smith Centre, and former Scottish Labour Party leader and former BBC correspondent, the man in the white suit, and former independent MP Martin Bell.